Stay tuned for a meeting of the Calabasas City Council. The meeting will be broadcast using Zoom and the city's CTV Channel 3. Members of the City Council may teleconference into the meeting without noticing or posting an agenda at their teleconference location. Besides the live TV and Zoom broadcast, the live stream of the meeting may be viewed online at cityofcalabasas.com/CTV Live. If you want to provide public comment, press Raise Hand if you're using Zoom or *9 if you're joining by phone. Just unmute yourself by pressing *6. Say your name and the city you live in. You'll be allowed 3 minutes to address the City Council regarding any items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Council. If the power or internet goes out lasting more than 15 minutes, or if there's some event that prevents the Council from meeting or prevents you from providing public comment, then the meeting will be adjourned. Any items noticed as public hearings will be rescheduled to the next regular meeting of the City Council. Any other agenda items the Council has not taken action on will be placed on a future agenda. Now, a meeting of the Calabasas City Council.
Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday, August 10th, 2022 regular or special study session meeting of the Calabasas City Council. My apologies for our late beginning. I'm Mary Sue Maurer, the mayor, and tonight I am joined by Mayor Pro Tem David Shapiro, Council members James Bozajian, Peter Kraut, and Alicia Weintraub. The Pledge of Allegiance tonight will be held by our climate change consultant, Dean Kubani. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you, Mayor Maurer. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
And a
I'll
second.
second that.
Okay. Roll call, please, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Bozajian.
Here.
Councilmember Kraut.
Aye.
Councilmember Weintraub.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro.
Yes.
Mayor Maurer.
Yes.
Carries 5-0.
All right. We're going to move on to oral communication and public comment. This is for items not on the agenda. And Madam Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to speak?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I see one hand up and let me see who that is. Sulaimi Gonzalez. And she's on the queue. If we can start the timer, Tony, please. Sulaimi, please introduce yourself and the city you live in.
Hi, my name is Sulaimi Gonzalez, and I'm an outreach analyst in the Department of Insurance. I'm here to give an update on the work we have been doing to protect California consumers. Since 2019, we've met with more than 25,000 people in 40 counties to specifically hear concerns around availability and affordability of homeowners insurance. In January 2022, Commissioner Lara and the state's emergency response and readiness agencies created Safer from Wildfires, a list of achievable, effective measures for homes and businesses. The ultimate goal is protecting consumers by reducing wildfire risk in their communities, making insurance available and affordable to all Californians. So let's go over the three steps or areas of protection under the Safer from Wildfires framework. It begins with protecting the structure. This means giving you specific things you can do to ensure your roof, walls, vents, windows, and are upgraded to be safer from wildfires. Number 2, it's protecting your immediate surroundings, such as your backyard, your deck, or other outbuildings. Finally, involving the entire community in fire protection. That includes programs like FireWise, which brings neighbors together to protect their homes. You can see a list of specific things you can do on our website at insurance.ca.gov. By making homes and businesses safer, we can bring risks down and bring costs down too. The commissioner's actions are focused on safety and transparency. His new regulations do this in 3 ways. One, pricing. He is requiring insurance companies to incorporate the Safer from Wildfires framework into their pricing. Insurance companies will have to submit new rate values that recognize safety. And two, transparency. Consumers will receive their property's wildfire risk score and the reasons for it. And the Department of Insurance will have oversight. And number three is the right of appeal. Consumers will be able to appeal their risk determination when they have done the work. We look to have these regulations implemented by this summer, by the end of this summer, and once implemented, the insurance companies will have to submit new rate values, and consumers should start seeing these changes early next year. So that concludes my presentation, and I want to remind you that we are here to help you with any of your insurance questions. Please give us that call at 1-800-927-4357 or go to our website, insurance.ca.gov.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, are there any other speakers?
No others, Madam Mayor.
All right. So we're going to move on to the item that we're going to be discussing tonight under new business. This is a study session devoted to planning for climate change and the development of a climate action plan. And at this point, I'm going to hand over the discussion beginnings to our city manager, Kendra Meek.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. It's good to be back with you. And as we start our next few months of council meetings, to be starting with something that is, I think, very important to Calabasas and to our community. I'm very much aware, and Dean will talk about this later on in his presentation, that Calabasas and especially the city council has been at the forefront of sustainability and climate resiliency for some time. What we are doing tonight is moving forward with some discussion on how to put that into a plan, a codified plan, an adopted plan by the city council. And this will take into account some of the wonderful things that have been done over the years, especially many things done under your leadership as you've sat in these seats. Dean Kubani is a consultant with the city. He is representing Kubani and Associates, a consulting firm. Prior to consulting, Dean worked with the city of Santa Monica for approximately 25 years, a wonderful career at the city of Santa Monica. When he retired as the chief sustainability officer and the assistant director of public works. During his tenure with the city of Santa Monica, he worked on projects with the community choice energy, leading to 100% renewable electricity, adoption of sustainable water master plan, an electric vehicle plan, zero net energy requirements for new residential construction, and the list goes on and on. So we're grateful to have Mr. Kubani with us tonight. The council initially started this process with the creation of the Sustainability Task Force last October, and Dean came on the team just a few months later. And so thank you, Dean, for being here tonight, and thank you for the work that you've done leading up to this.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kendon, and it's great to be here. Could I ask the city clerk to include or to let Walker Wells, my associate, in so I can introduce him. I'll give the presentation tonight, but I'd like Walker to be on because I'm sure some questions will come up that'll help. Great, I see Walker right there.
Jason.
And I am going to share my screen. And there we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great. So what we're here to talk about tonight, actually, is various options and approaches to reduce climate emissions and improve resilience in Calabasas. And I'm here tonight with my associate Walker Wells, who I will introduce. Let's see here. Hang on, I'm just sorting out my screen. Great. So Kendra gave a great introduction for me. I worked at Santa Monica. I have a lot of experience with climate planning. I previously worked at the Climate Institute way back in 1993. If you do the math, that's almost 30 years ago. In Washington, D.C., working with other cities to help them develop climate plans back then. I'm also currently an adjunct professor at Cal Poly Pomona and starting this fall at Loyola Marymount. And my associate, Walker Wells, has 25 years of municipal, nonprofit, and private sector experience in urban planning, as well as green building and sustainability. And Walker is a certified urban planner. He's a lead associate professional, and he is an adjunct professor at the Claremont Colleges and also at UCLA, and is a great wealth of information around urban planning as it relates to climate change. He also has a lot of experience with climate planning plans as well. So I wanted to spend just a minute talking about our role here. I was brought on by Kindon to help the City Council achieve a common understanding of what's possible and what the various approaches are to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also preparing for future risks that climate change poses, both to the city government and its residents. And our goal both tonight and for this project that I've been brought on for is really to help council move forward with its climate change planning in a very clear and thoughtful way and ultimately successful way. I spoke to all of the council members in advance of the meeting just to get your input, and I heard from lots of you that we don't need a Climate 101 presentation tonight because most of you understand what that is, and that's kind of beyond the scope, which I completely understand. I did want to show one slide just to frame this for the people that are listening and watching. The Earth is getting warmer due to climate change. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right around in the early 1800s, the planet has warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius. You can see the graph of annual temperatures, and they've been going up and up and up. One thing that you may all be familiar with is that heating up the planet also has a number of pretty significant impacts. The impacts that we are expecting and climate models tell us will be hitting Southern California are things that just what you might think: more extreme heat events, worsening air quality, more frequent and longer droughts, more wildfires, more intense storms, and also in our coastal areas, increased coastal flooding and erosion. Another thing that you may be familiar with in the last 30 or 40 years, since there's been much more of a scientific focus on climate change, most of the models have told us that somewhere between the middle of this century and the end of this century, we're going to start feeling these effects or seeing more of these effects. But one thing that scientists have been finding just in the last 8 or 9 years is that the previous linear models that had gradual increases in greenhouse emissions and climate change impacts on the planet were overly conservative and were incorrect. And what they've been finding, and I'll show you with these two headlines, is that climate change is happening a lot faster than was originally expected. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a international panel of scientists that produces reports and evaluates climate change around the world and basically provides the basis for all the science around climate change, released a report in 2014 saying that they were seeing climate change proceeding faster than the models anticipated. And then this headline from 2017 says that when they released another report, that it was going even faster than they saw back in 2014. And then this lower headline here from 2021 says, again, the climate change has speeded up beyond what the models predicted. So scientists are seeing that rather than a linear path towards climate change, what we're getting is a more logarithmic path that's speeding up and making these impacts seen actually right now. And one of the things that I've been doing in my classes is current events. At the beginning of every class, I ask students to bring in current events about climate and sustainability. And one of the things I've seen over the last 3 years is more and more frequent articles in the papers and headlines about climate impacts, now almost daily. And so if we go through that list that I showed you of expected impacts in Southern California from climate change, we see a lot of things. I pulled a few things from the paper just recently. Here was one from last month in July. The UK Meteorological Office a few years back produced a theoretical forecast for the year 2050 for what the weather would likely be in the UK in 2050. And then just last month, they had an actual weather forecast that almost mirrored that theoretical forecast. That's 28 years before. And 3 days later, here were the headlines. Britain faces its hottest day ever. It got up to over 108. Likewise, in Europe, there were warnings of heat apocalypse in parts of France. There were fires throughout Spain and Portugal. And likewise, we've seen just recently record heat events in Pacific Northwest, in the Southeast, and also in the East in the United States. So this stuff is happening, again, faster than the models just a few years ago were predicting. Looking at droughts, I pulled a few headlines from, I went too far there. From earlier this year, the Western United States is in its worst mega drought in 1,200 years. And then, of course, we're all very familiar with our current drought in California. We've all been feeling its impacts and having to cut back on water. So this is very much, if you've lived in California for the last few years, this is starting to get to be deja vu, and we're getting more and more of these droughts. More intense and damaging storms. You may remember just back at the end of June up in Yellowstone, the entire park was closed down for several days because of intense, kind of unprecedented flooding. They had very high unseasonable rains coupled with very unseasonable warm temperatures, melted a lot of snow and created all this flooding and damaged a number of roads into and out of Yellowstone. We've also been seeing this type of storm event happening locally. You might remember from last December at Leo Carrillo State Park, we had 4.5 to 6 inches of rain in the Santa Monica Mountains in under 2 days. And it basically wiped out Leo Carrillo State Park. And of course, if you've been following the news lately, catastrophic flooding in eastern Kentucky has killed dozens of people. I just read last week in Seoul, Korea, they had 18 inches of rain in 48 hours, which is the worst flooding event they have on record there. So this is happening locally and around the country, around the world. And then, of course, wildfires. We have been seeing 7 of the 10 most destructive fires in California history have occurred since 2015. If you look at this chart right here, California fires, the amount of acres burned every year since 1971 has been increasing logarithmically. And of course, we are all familiar with the Woolsey fire that went through in 2018, generated over $6 billion in damages. So this is a clear and present danger, particularly in Calabasas and the Santa Monica Mountains region. Just earlier this year, and you may remember from a previous council meeting earlier in the year, the Malibu Foundation developed an assessment of the wildland urban interface region of the Santa Monica Mountains, which includes Calabasas. And they did an assessment of what the potential risks are, and they found a list very similar to that one I showed you at the beginning. Extreme heat, and you'll see Calabasas is in this circled area. It looks like that's the area in this region that's going to be impacted most by extreme heat events. They found future vulnerability of roads, and a lot of them are within Calabasas, from increased storms, flooding, and landslides, things like that. And then, of course, wildfire risk we all know about, and Calabasas being in the wildland urban interface is highly at risk as well. So I'm not putting all this stuff up here to scare anyone, but rather I wanted to start this presentation this way just because for the people listening, to put this discussion in context. It's not a nice thing to do to be planning for climate change. It's an imperative. Climate change is already here and it's getting worse, and everyone needs to take action to address it if we are to have a prosperous future moving forward. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report talking about what can be done, and they said, you know what, we actually can address this and avoid the worst impacts of climate change if we hold the temperature rise, the global temperature rise, to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I told you at the beginning, we've already increased by about 1.2 degrees. So we're under that mark, and we can reduce our emissions significantly and get there. However, right now, with the current emissions profile globally, we're on track for a 3 to 4 degree temperature rise, which would be catastrophic. The IPCC says we need to cut emissions almost in half by the year 2030 in order to meet this goal. So they're telling us they've really drawn a line in the sand and are waving red flags saying we need to do something very quickly if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Now I'm going to shift gears. I mentioned that I had interviewed all of the council members in advance of the meeting to ask them about climate change, what their priorities are, what the issues are in the community. And I was very happy to hear and see that it sounds like the council members are very interested and thinking about a lot of these issues already and actually moving forward on some of this stuff already. I heard concerns about drought and wildfires from almost everybody on council, as well as they're hearing that from constituents in Calabasas. Preservation of open space in Calabasas is a very high priority. I heard the desire for Calabasas to continue to be a leader. I heard a strong desire from everyone on council for action and results, meaning you don't want to develop a plan that's going to sit on a shelf. You want to focus on things that are going to make real change and achieve real positive results for your residents. And I hear that loud and clear. And I also heard that cost and resources are an issue. You're a small city, you don't have a huge budget, you don't have a huge staff. And so we need to be strategic as we're moving forward with this. I also looked at your environmental strategic priorities for your adopted budget you adopted earlier this year. And I saw that these four up on the screen: food waste reduction, water resiliency, acquisition of open space, and updating your procurement policy, rose to the top. That's great news. You're already taking steps towards addressing climate change and resiliency by prioritizing these actions. So that's very good news. I also looked and I spoke with some of your staff and looked at kind of past and current efforts to address the environment and climate in Calabasas, and found a great list, particularly the thing on the top of this list, that you joined the Clean Power Alliance and are providing a default 100% renewable electricity to your residents and businesses. That's fantastic news. You've made some moves towards greening your fleet, towards providing some EV charging stations in the community, providing some energy efficiency programs, some green building. You've done some great work on watershed management and restoration. So again, well, the reason I'm putting these up here, a lot of times when people think about climate planning, they are worried about it's this whole new big effort that we have to do and we don't have enough time or people. And I really want you to recognize that you're actually not starting from zero. You're already doing a lot of the things that would be in a climate action and adaptation plan. Likewise, in your general plan, you've got some climate goals in that plan, in your housing element, to set forth land use and conservation strategies to address energy conservation and climate change, to update green building checklist and provide building applicants with information on energy efficiency. In your conservation element of your general plan, you have language about climate change, and you are in the process or have already drafted a new safety element, which is in development, and I understand it's going to come to you probably next month. And that has numerous provisions that are related to climate change, particularly adaptation to climate change and resilience, addressing slope stability around your roads, mitigating flooding and fire hazards, and a variety of other things. So again, this is good news. This is the work you've done in the safety element goes a long way towards addressing adaptation and being part of an adaptation plan. And this is one of the maps that you'll be seeing when this is brought to council from the draft plan. You've already mapped very high fire hazard severity zones and critical facilities in the city. You've been looking at some of the roadways, the kind of single entry and exit point roadways that are susceptible to flooding and blockage, and they also need to be used as evacuation routes. So you're looking at mitigation for that type of stuff, which is great news. And then I'm going to end this prelude here with just some context in the state of California, because the state has probably some of the most aggressive climate goals in the country, if not the world. And I wanted to talk very briefly about what the state of California has adopted and also how that trickles down to Calabasas. The Senate Bill 32 was pretty groundbreaking when it was adopted in 2016. It set a reduction goal for the entire state of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And it requires local governments to recognize and show alignment with this when preparing their general plans. The state also set up a renewable portfolio standard, which is trying to get to 100% zero carbon, 100% renewable power by 2045 in the state, and 60% by 2030. And a couple of other standards, the low carbon fuel standard, the sustainable community strategy, which is addressing reducing vehicle miles traveled, all are looking at are very aggressive ways that the state is approaching climate change. And as I mentioned, there are a number of requirements for local governments. Senate Bill 379 applies to your all city safety elements, and your city staff are already well on their way to updating yours so that it is in compliance with that, which is great. The California Building Code, Title 24, energy efficiency standards, and the Green Building Code are going into effect. So basically, those are the law of the land throughout the city, all cities throughout the state, unless a city adopts more stringent codes. So this is helping to ensure that all new buildings in Calabasas and anywhere else in the state are very energy efficient and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then SB 1383, organic waste diversion, this is to reduce methane emissions from related to solid waste that's landfilled. And again, your city and in your budget priorities, you highlighted organic waste diversion as one of your priorities. So you're working already towards meeting compliance with this requirement too. So that's my prelude. And now we're going to jump into a discussion of climate planning. Initially, what is a climate action plan? Why is it important? We'll talk a little bit about climate mitigation and adaptation, what the differences are, and then an anatomy of a climate plan. And then I'm going to go into 4 different examples of approaches that Calabasas may wish to take for climate planning. First, what is a climate plan? Basically, it is a way to specifically address or to reach climate goals for a city, a county, a region, a state. And all climate plans, they may look different, but they generally have this very similar elements. They include an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. How much climate changing pollution are we putting into the atmosphere from our city or our region? Once that's done, they include a target. How much do we want to reduce? A lot of cities adopt the state targets, which I just read out to you, or they adopt more aggressive targets. But they're really saying this is where we want to get to. And then the plan is based on that initial inventory and those targets. The plan just basically consists of a list of actions that community, either the city government or stakeholders in the community or businesses or residents, and likely all of them, will be taking in order to meet that target. And plans are, some are much more detailed, some are less detailed, but they all basically chart a path to reaching the target. And then the other part is really the implementation. Implementing the plan, monitoring and tracking your progress towards meeting the goals, recognizing whatever achievements you've made, and then doing your inventory again and seeing where you've gotten to, how much have we reduced, and then adjusting as necessary. So that's a very simple picture of what a climate plan is. I'm going to talk in a minute about why developing a climate plan is very important. But briefly, I've mentioned climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Mitigation basically means all the stuff that you're doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So emissions from primarily fossil fuels and methane from landfill solid waste. So these are the actions: energy efficiency, buying renewable energy, getting people out of their cars, using sustainable transportation. And then adaptation is actions that manage the impacts of climate change. So how are we going to adapt our city to flooding or more fires or lots of heat days? So that's what an adaptation plan is. Some actions do both. Your urban forest helps mitigate because it absorbs greenhouse gas emissions. It's a carbon sink, but it also provides shade. So it provides cooling, and that helps mitigate the impacts or the effects we're feeling of climate change. So that's what we mean when we say adaptation and mitigation. And for an anatomy of a climate plan, I just wanted to show one that I'm familiar with. This is Santa Monica's plan, which was adopted in 2019. It's a climate action and adaptation plan, so it addresses both mitigation, reducing emissions, and adapting to climate. And I'm using this because it has some really simple, clear diagrams. The plan includes an emissions inventory. So basically, how much is Santa Monica, all the people who live in Santa Monica, all the people that work in Santa Monica, all the people that visit Santa Monica, and all their activities contributing to climate change. And what percentage comes from what sector. So you can see this pie chart shows that about 2/3 of the emissions in Santa Monica in 2015 came from vehicles. And about 1/3 came from energy use in buildings. And the remaining little pieces, 3% came from solid waste and 2% came from aviation fuel. That's because Santa Monica has its own airport. So this is important to know where our emissions come from and how big our emissions are, and that allows us to plot a target. So that emissions inventory tells us, what our annual carbon emissions are, what level they are, and it allows us to track them by periodically measuring it. So, and it allows us to set a target. So all this dotted line is Santa Monica's target. In Santa Monica adopted a target of an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030, and now has a target of net zero carbon emissions by, originally it was 2050 or sooner, and the council has since pushed that forward. So, and I'm happy to report in 2020 at the last emissions inventory, the city was 60% below 1990 levels, so it was right about down here. So it is on track or a little ahead of track towards meeting those targets. And then the action plan on the adaptation side includes a community vulnerability assessment. It's looking at what are the likely impacts within our city from climate change. Santa Monica is a coastal city, so sea level rise is going to impact both buildings and infrastructure that are eventually will be below sea level. So basically looking at all the various infrastructure and how that might be impacted by high heat days or increased storming or flooding from sea level rise. And then also looking at where the heat events are going to take place. A lot of the similar stuff that you've done already in your safety element. This is part of the adaptation piece of the plan. And then based on all of this information, you develop a list of measures or actions. So this is a very simple summary of the plan, which includes a lot more detail. This includes climate action. So these are measures that mitigate climate change, reduce emissions, and then climate adaptation, prepare the community for the impacts that we know are coming. So a number of actions to reduce emissions from building energy use, energy efficiency, installing renewable power, purchasing renewable power, and then addressing methane emissions from landfill waste. The city has a zero waste plan and a target to get to zero waste by, I can't remember what it is, but I think 2040 possibly. And sustainable mobility to address that 2/3 of the pie of emissions coming from passenger vehicles and burning of fossil fuels. And then for adaptation, it's looking at increasing community resilience. So looking at our vulnerable populations and what do we need to do to make sure that they can survive impacts, more heat days and other types of impacts, worse air quality. The city has a water self-sufficiency plan and a goal to achieve water self-sufficiency, getting all their water from local sources by 2023. And then coastal flooding preparedness, looking at sea level rise. So I think you get the idea. The one thing that I'm not showing you here, but is also a key and important component is, oh wait, I forgot. This is also in the plan. Once you have your list of measures, you want to model those. You want to look at all those different individual things that you are thinking of doing and seeing how effective those are going to be at getting you to your goal. So here is our 80% target below 1990 levels. And by adding up the carbon reduction impact of each of the measures from zero carbon buildings and zero waste and mobility, we'll see that we can actually get to that goal. You also see that the state policies, there's a lot of things that are going on at the state level that the city doesn't even have to do that are going to significantly reduce emissions before or during while the city's doing this that are going to help get us to the goal. And so all cities in California are going to reap the benefits of that work. But also the other piece that I'm not showing you in the plan is an implementation component. So it's basically once you have that list of actions that you're going to do, you need to identify who's going to be the lead on them, who from the city, who from the community is responsible for achieving those, and what resources are available for that. Do you have budget resources? When do you need to include that in your budget? So thinking all that stuff through is the reason you want to have a plan. When I spoke with all of you, several of you said, well, since we've seen lots of climate plans and we know, and I told you that like Santa Monica, I think when you do an emissions inventory of the city, it's going to look a lot like Santa Monica. It's probably about 60% of your emissions are coming from vehicles and about 1/3 are coming from energy use in buildings and probably 5% from landfill waste. Also, most cities are doing very similar things to both mitigate and adapt to climate. So my partner Walker and I sat down and we did a little back of napkin exercise and said, okay, looking at Calabasas, the size of the city, your budget resources, your ability to act, meaning, you may not have, your own transit system, so you can't do a lot with transit, or, there's certain things that you do have, but there's a lot of things that you don't have. What realistically could Calabasas do? What would a climate action plan look like? The most likely actions that we came up with for mitigation: maintaining high participation in your 100% renewable electricity. That goes a long way towards cutting your emissions. Develop a local building reach code, which is basically goes beyond the state requirements, that would phase out natural gas in new construction and major remodels. Come up with programs to address existing buildings, to retrofit them so that they're more efficient. One thing is to build new buildings that are very clean, but you've got a lot more old buildings that are not as efficient. So addressing that can significantly reduce your emissions too. You can also promote a shift to electric vehicles. I realize that Calabasas doesn't sell vehicles, but what you can do is incentivize people who drive electric vehicles by providing electric vehicle charging stations, by providing policies that make it easier for people to drive vehicles, free parking for EVs. That's what they have in Santa Monica, and other types of things. So there are things you can do to promote that. Meet your SB 1383 requirements for organic waste diversion. And again, you're already on the way to doing that. And then look at your open space. I saw that about 45% of the city limits of Calabasas is open space. That is a great resource right now, but it can also be used for carbon sequestration, for ways to take carbon from the atmosphere and put it into the ground through various intensive composting programs and other types of things, and tree planting. So that's probably what a mitigation plan might look like. An adaptation plan would look similarly, looking at expanding where you can local water resources, capturing stormwater and reusing it, even capturing some sewage and treating it and reusing it for non-drinking water purposes. Lots of emergency preparation for fires and storms and flooding and heat, which would include hardening your infrastructure and roads, safeguarding them from washouts and landslides, creating resilience hubs for vulnerable populations. And again, you're starting to do a lot of that in your safety element right now. So this is what this type of a plan would look like. Again, I'm saying all this because I'm kind of pointing out that you're already doing a lot of the stuff that would be in a plan. So why should you bother with a climate action and adaptation plan? I think it's very important that all cities move ahead with this, and that's because you all said you want action and you want things to happen. If you just started working on a number of random actions or programs or policies, but didn't know where your emissions were coming from or what level your emissions were at, you wouldn't know how successful those programs are at reducing them, how effective the programs are, whether you need to change them or expand them, or even which programs to do first. If you develop a plan and go through a process, you're going to be setting goals that are very specific to Calabasas. You're going to ensure that your climate planning is consistent with your existing local plans and your programs and the issues that are of concern to your community. You are already doing a lot of things, your safety element, a number of environmental programs and policies, but I doubt that all the people that are working on those in your city government are actually sitting at the table at the same time and discussing these and integrating them. And you can actually, this process would bring those people together and help make those plans more effective and impactful. A climate action plan evaluates and prioritizes actions with a focus on your community goals. So basically, rather than just having a list of actions, you're going to have discussions about which one should we do first and why. Which ones are going to be the biggest bang for our buck, that type of a thing. A plan will allow measurement of your progress towards the goals. It'll establish procedures for tracking your progress and for implementation. A good plan will identify implementation resources and responsibilities, both staff and people, and funding. And it allows comparison with peer cities. And that's not in a competitive way, but necessarily all cities are learning from each other. Nobody knows the right way to do things, but by having a plan and by looking at other cities' plans, you can see what's working, what's not working, and that helps you improve your plan and improve what's going on in Calabasas. So that's why it makes sense to move forward with some level of a plan. So what I provided to you in advance of the meeting, and I believe is posted with the agenda, were 4 different approaches that I think are very illustrative of ways that Calabasas could move forward. And I selected these not because they are 4 of the best plans. I was looking for small cities similar in population and demographics roughly to Calabasas in California that had different types of climate action plans. And I think there's pros and cons to each of these, but I think taken together, they show kind of a good idea of what a good plan should look like and ways that you can proceed. The first 2 plans from Claremont and Mill Valley were done in-house by their staff and cost very little money for them to do, and were relatively quick to do. The 3rd and 4th plan from Albany and Agoura Hills, your neighbor, were done primarily under the lead of consultants or consultant teams, and were more expensive to put in place and took a bit longer. I'm going to walk through each of these quickly, and then we'll jump into a discussion and answer any questions you might have, and go on from there. So I'm going to start with Claremont, which is they included climate in their sustainability plan. So they don't have a separate climate action plan, but they have a sustainable city plan that they originally adopted in 2008, and they've updated it a couple of times. And they've adopted various goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and actions to achieve those goals into a broader sustainability plan that includes other environmental goals. They did this because they had a community vision for, we don't want to just address climate. We have a lot of other things that we want to focus on in this community that are important to our residents. So we're developing this broader plan. I mentioned they developed it in-house. They did not use any funding they didn't have to generate any additional funding outside of what was in their regular departmental budgets. And their initial development process took about a year, but that was because they spent a lot of time getting community input on this. They could have done it quicker, but it was important to them to get community input. And these goal areas show you what this plan addresses. There's not a climate goal area, but they've addressed climate in a number of areas. In resource conservation, they are addressing energy use and solid waste reduction. In transportation, they're looking at things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Open space and biodiversity, they're looking at tree planting and those types of things. So throughout their plan, they have specific targets and action steps that address climate. So here's an example of some of their things that they're measuring and they're tracking, and their goals for reducing carbon-based electricity, for reducing natural gas use in the community, gasoline used in city vehicles, and they have long lists of these action steps that they're going to take, and they include who's going to be doing them, whether it's the city or some outside agency or residents or businesses. So there are a number of pros and cons to this plan. It's inexpensive, used in-house resources. It's very focused on action rather than on analysis and modeling, which some of the later plans cost a lot of money because it has analysis and modeling. It includes very specific goals and indicators and targets. And it's broader than just addressing climate. It addresses other environmental concerns in the community. Some of the cons that I see from this plan, there's no specific climate target. They haven't said by X date, we want to reduce our citywide emissions by a certain percent. They haven't modeled or prioritized their actions, so they have a long laundry list of actions, but because they haven't modeled them to see which ones are going to do more at reducing emissions, all of those actions are presented in their plan as having an equal value. And so it doesn't really break out what they're going to do first and what they're going to do second. They haven't really looked at the cost. I've spoken to their staff in previous years and also just recently and found that implementation of this continues to be difficult because it's entirely led by their staff, and it's a lot of work. They don't have a detailed implementation plan, so they're not moving as quickly as they expected, and this is not a qualified climate action adaptation plan. I meant earlier to talk about the fourth plan that we're going to talk about is called it's a qualified plan. Basically what that means is it meets all of the state qualifications, goes through a CEQA process, and by adopting a qualified plan, a city would be able to avoid CEQA process for individual large developments in the community. So it might be able, if it has an approved qualified climate action and adaptation plan that's approved by the state, it wouldn't have to develop individual climate plans for large projects or do EIRs or go through a CEQA process for those projects, because the qualified plan takes care of the entire city. So that's what we mean when I say qualified plan. I'm going to go on to option number 2, which was the city of Mill Valley. They incorporated a climate action and adaptation plan into their general plan. And you can see it's one of several elements of their general plan. Again, this was led by staff. They did this in 2013. They did bring in a consultant to do a little bit of quantification of their emission reductions based on what they were proposing. But it was a very small amount. It took about a year to do, but again, this was part of a larger general plan update. So just this piece was done relatively rapidly, and it cost them about $10,000. They're currently, they told me, undergoing an update process. They've got $50,000 budgeted for that. They're bringing in consultants and they're doing a much more detailed plan right now. But what they've got are some pretty high level policies and programs in that plan. And they're a little bit passive. The first one there, consider requiring that energy audits for residential and commercial buildings be performed prior to completion of sale. Replace street and public parking lot lights with more energy efficient lamps, but they don't say where or when. Participate in certain opportunities that may come up. So these are pretty high level policies. They're great and they have a number of them, but they're not very detailed. So really the pros for this approach were they used their in-house resources. It was very low initial cost. It's integrated with their general plan, which is great. They've looked at their other general plan elements and it fits in there very nicely. The cons are that they haven't really developed a detailed list of actions that really chart a course towards reducing emissions. They don't have an implementation plan. And again, this isn't a qualified climate action and adaptation plan. The third option comes from the city of Albany, and Albany hired a consultant to develop a standalone climate action and adaptation plan. And this is very similar to what I would say a majority of cities that are doing plans that look like Albany's plan. This one was developed, it was adopted in 2019, December. It was developed by Cascade Consulting Group and Rincon Consultants. The city staff told me that they were very involved in the community input process. Again, Albany really highly prized community input, so the staff really led that process. The consultants were doing most of the modeling and plan development and emissions analysis. This took almost a year and a half, and it involved a significant amount of community engagement, which is why it took so long. The cost was $73,000 for their consultant services, and they brought in a Civic Spark intern, which I'll talk about a little bit later. This is a one-year internship that can be used as staff. These are folks that are familiar with climate planning, and they were brought on board to assist staff with the process. And you can see their plan compared to Mill Valley's has much more detailed goals and actions. They've got, their actions are very specific, and they are looking at order of magnitude of costs, how much it's going to cost to do them. They're evaluating the benefits of those things, and that helps them they prioritize what they want to do first and second and third. So this has more detail than what we saw in Mill Valley. The plan is also very clear and accessible. It doesn't read like a general plan document. And I know you council members have read general plan documents, and they're not the greatest of reading. No offense to planners, but they're tend to be pretty dry. Albany's plan, I think any resident in the city can pick that up and read it and understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, why that makes sense, when it's going to happen, and how they can get involved. So it's a very clear, accessible plan. It involves significant input. It has very detailed goals and specific actions. It does not include specific implementation measures and responsibilities, although the staff told me that they are developing that right now. So that's kind of a part 2 for this plan. But if you look at it now, it doesn't include that stuff. And again, it's not a qualified cap, so it won't get the city out of private developers out of doing their own climate plans for significant projects in the community. And then that brings us to option 4, which is your neighbor Agoura Hills. They developed a qualified climate action and adaptation plan using a consultant team. And they hired a firm called LSA Associates. So this plan will comprehensively address state requirements and recommendations for climate plans, and it adopts the state targets for emission reductions. It includes a full CEQA review process. They completed a draft last March. It took 12 months for plan development and about 8 months in the CEQA process. It cost $150,000 to develop the plan, and an additional $110,000 for CEQA process, the development of a monitoring dashboard. So when they're implementing it, they're able to track how effective it is. And they hired a Civic Spark intern to assist with their implementation phase. So this plan is, it reads like a general plan element. It's very dry and boring. It's not something somebody would pick up and read and really easily understand. However, it does include really good pieces. And it's very, very thorough. Its implementation plan is looking at what's it going to take from the staffing side to implement this, from a budget and finance side. What's our strategy for implementation? How are we going to prioritize different things? How are we going to involve the public? How are we going to monitor this? What are we going to do looking into the future? So there's a great detailed implementation process here, which means that this plan is very likely to be implemented because the city has spent a lot of time and effort figuring out how they're going to do that. Again, here they've said we're tying this plan directly to our budget and to our CIP program. We're going to need to upgrade some of our infrastructure. That's part of our CIP. So all of these actions, we have to pay for them somehow. They're going to come out of our budget, or they're going to come out of other resources that we find from the state or from the federal government or elsewhere. So this is a qualified cap, which is a pro. Involves a lot of community input and engagement. The measures are very thorough and based on a thorough analysis. They're very detailed, both for climate mitigation and adaptation. They have an excellent implementation plan. Cons, it's expensive. It took a long time to put together, and it's a very long technical document and possibly more analysis than is actually really needed to identify the priority actions at this point, but a good plan nonetheless. So I'm kind of summing up here, and then we're going to jump into some discussion. these are the 4 plans that I shared with you, and just kind of the highlights of each of them. The Claremont and Mill Valley plans were very low cost, and the lead were city staff. Claremont's plan doesn't include an inventory, doesn't include a forecast. It does have clear goals and targets. It has specific measures and actions. It hasn't modeled those. It hasn't prioritized those. It only has a very general, high-level implementation plan, and there's no monitoring of this. It's not a qualified plan. Mill Valley did an inventory. They did an emissions forecast. They adopted targets. Their measures and actions are very high level, and they've done only partial modeling of those measures. They don't have an implementation plan. And based on that plan, my assessment is that it's very likely that they haven't done a lot with it since they adopted it in 2013. And that's what I learned from their staff when I talked to them. And part of the reason why they're updating it right now is to make it a more detailed plan that includes some of that implementation. Albany's costs $73,000, led by a consultant team, includes an inventory of forecast, goals, targets, action measures, a little bit of modeling, but not that much. And they're working on an implementation plan. And again, very accessible document, and very useful. Again, this is coming from a city of about 20,000 people. And was really quite a good effort. And then Agoura Hills kind of ticks all the boxes, and they get the very expensive plan that is incredibly detailed and, you know, goes from A to Z and addresses everything. So with that, I've been talking for quite a long time, but I wanted to toss out a few questions and really discuss, ultimately get at what approach best aligns with Calabasas's needs and resources. And you know your staff resources better than I do, and your budget resources better than I do. You've had a look at all of these. Walker and I are here to answer any questions you might have, because we've dumped a lot of information on you, and we're happy to help kind of lead a discussion on where you go from here. So why don't I turn it back over to you, Mary Sue?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. That was very informative and helpful to get a range of options to look at. And I want to turn to my colleagues. I think at this point, I'm going to actually ask Kindon to respond to kind of the resource question as far as staff resources, especially so that we can be mindful of that as we move forward. And then Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro and I talked earlier and thought maybe the best route would be for us to go plan by plan for questions, comments. And so how does that sound? We'll ask Kindon to kind of tee up capacity and resources, and then Kindon go to each plan.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Let me just address a couple of those. And Dean, thank you for this and leading into this and helping us see the different models and options out there. In regard to staff resources and the ability to implement, one of the things that we've been looking at over time is really making our staff more streamlined and efficient, which means over the last year, we've not been filling some positions. Coupled with that, we've seen an increased workload and potentially could have some big projects on the horizon, especially for our planning department, and our public works is also in the middle of some big projects now and anticipating some over time. Because of that, if the council so desires, I see an outside consultant as one of the best ways to move this forward quickly. Again, that would be contingent on funding and the scope of the project that we'd like to do. I think an outside consultant gives us an opportunity to utilize the staff and maximize the talents that we have, but have a really strong leader, I guess, in that regards, that is helping us help ourselves, use those talents to the best that we can put something back to council quickly. So that would be my recommendation, and that depends again on the overall discussion by you as council and what you'd like to see. If it's a much smaller plan, I think we'd like to look at that as staff and then come back with further recommendations. But if it's a bigger plan, for sure, with a consultant team.
Okay, Walker Wells, welcome, and thank you for all the work you've done on these types of projects. Did you want to give a general thought before we begin discussing the individual plans?
No, just want to say good evening, and happy to be here. And it's been great working with Dean to try and come up with 4 examples that would give you a good sort of spectrum of options about how to go about doing this, from using in-house staff up to, hiring a consultant team to do, sort of the full suite of options, including the certified plan and tracking documents. So I think, our goal was to show you some different ways of doing it. And then I think to come back to this core question, like what's going to be of greatest benefit, but also, what can you afford to do given the staff you have available and also the funds that you have available. Because one thing I can say is, this question of the qualified plan is important to consider. It's seen as the gold standard. It meets, the tests in the CEQA guidelines for being a qualified plan. Other plans can be qualified, not just climate action plans, but they do need to use substantial evidence and best available data and go through some things. But the benefit that you get is this, streamlining of development projects. And that's only useful if you want to streamline development projects. So if you're not interested in streamlining development projects, then having them go through their own GHG analysis isn't necessarily a negative for you. So I just share that because it's often presented as the best version, but it may be providing a benefit that isn't of a particular value to your community.
Thank you for the added information about a qualified plan, because indeed the question is, do we want to streamline development projects? That's the trade-off there. I want to turn to Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro before we move to our colleagues. I do want to say that Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro and I do have a recommendation, but we thought we would hang on to that along with the consultant until you've had your discussions. And then we would go at the end if that's okay with the council. Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro, did you want to add anything?
No, I would wait to see if that's how the council wishes to proceed, then that's fine.
And I see Councilmember Weintraub's hand up.
I was just going to say, I'm interested to hear your thoughts since you guys are on the subcommittee. I don't need to wait to hear your thoughts till the end. I'd be interested in hearing them as the beginning of our discussion.
Okay, I think that's great. And by the way, our Councilmember Shapiro and I's recommendations was actually the same as our consultant, so he can chime in as well. So I was immediately, well, first of all, let me say that for me, one of the driving factors in how I looked at each of the plans was how quickly we could get something meaningful done, have it implemented, and hold the plan accountable. So I was looking at really trying to just go as quickly as we could with the best product as we could. So I selected Albany, and I selected it for a few reasons that some were outlined. But first of all, I thought it was very public friendly, very, very easy to read, and a significant amount of public participation, which I think sometimes can slow down the process. But with our environmental commission model, by adding more meetings, we could very easily keep this moving at a quick pace as it's developing, and ensuring that we've got the public's input. I found their actions that they listed to be very relevant to our own city in almost all exceptions. Demographically, we are different, but as I read it, I thought this sounds like our city. And not only the actions part of it, but just the values of that city. it spoke to me as being very much like Calabasas. The goals were reachable. I could see us prioritizing them and beginning to work on them very quickly. I like the fact that it stands alone. That told me that we could move quickly without it being tied to a general plan or other plans. And we've worked with the Rincon consultants before. I'm not saying that's who we choose, but we certainly are familiar with them and they are familiar with our city. So those were some of the reasons why I selected the Albany plan, and I'll ask my colleague, Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro, for his thoughts.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think you've covered most of it. I found something interesting in all of the plans, and I wanted to thank Dean and Walker, who's on here, and Kindon, and of course you, Mary Sue, for the hard work and bringing this forward. It's a lot of information and material to read through this. We also have the Santa Monica plan we've gone through previously, and each plan has some things that would be wonderful to adapt. I like the city of Claremont's idea of sustainability incorporating climate change as a broader picture as well. I liked Mill Valley having it also in the general plan, which we have somewhat. And Agura's qualified plan is wonderful. It's just along the lines of what we spoke about and being economical and keeping within the budget. That's something we need to keep in mind. So to me, again, same as you, the Albany option was the best option, the most applicable or apropos to our city. It has specific action plan. It's easier to implement. It's very easy for the public to understand and us to understand. And it also has the option of future options and goals, and we can expand upon that. So I am very much appreciative of this and having this come forward, and thank everybody for their hard work. But my recommendation, like yours jointly, is for the city of Albany plan.
And then, Dean, do you want to comment on why you thought this was an appropriate plan, Russ?
Sure, I will. And if I can, I'll share my screen again. I prepared a slide and I didn't want to prejudice your discussion with Walker and my recommendation, but I prepared a slide that includes my recommendation. I'll bring that up so we can kind of go over it. So here is our recommended approach, which is a modified version of the Albany approach, which is developing a standalone climate action and adaptation plan. And what we would suggest is that you identify in-house resources, if available, to lead the project, and if necessary, contract with outside experts to complete any parts of the plan that can't be completed by staff. That could include also a couple of these cities brought in Civic Spark interns. And I've known cities in Santa Monica had a Civic Spark intern for several years working with us on different aspects of our climate plan. I would say, like Albany, complete an emissions inventory, set goals for the community, decide amongst yourselves what reductions you want to achieve. Use your vulnerability assessment that you've already done for your safety element as part of it. You've already gone a long way with that, so you're not going to have to pay for another one of those. And look at using a list of measures and actions that have been identified by similar cities. Look at Agoura Hills. They've done all this. They spent a lot of money on it. They're right next door. I think the majority of those things are applicable. Look at Albany's. I also sent you a link to, there's a list of probably over 100 plans that have been developed in California. A lot of them are very similar. So I don't think you need to hire a consultant to go into a lot of detail identifying measures. You can come in with a list of measures and actions that have already been identified and do some work on those. What are those measures going to look like in Calabasas, maybe you have a consultant kind of look at some list that's kind of a prepackaged list. And then definitely, and this gets to your action, prepare a detailed implementation plan that really identifies who's going to do the work and how you're going to pay for it. And that includes, I know that your budget's not huge, but there is a ton of state money, and I've included a slide with a bunch of resources from the state. The cap and trade money, there is a lot of it at the state of California. Unfortunately, not very much for planning. Usually that kind of horse has already left the barn, but right now it's a lot of implementation, and particularly kind of resilience, adaptation, implementation for projects and those types of things. So there's a lot of resources out there that you could identify to help you implement a plan. But as all of you have said, you really want to, you don't want this thing sitting on the shelf. You want it to achieve results. I think the failure to achieve results that I've seen most in the municipal world is when you haven't spent the time to, figure out who's going to do the work and how are you going to pay for it. And I think that's probably the biggest part of the plan. The measures, we already gave you a list of measures. That's probably pretty good. We can guess what your inventory is going to be, but it's worth doing. But really having that implementation plan of figuring out who's going to do it and how you're going to pay for it is really going to ensure that it's actually going to be followed through, and you're going to meet the goals that you set. And then likewise, establishing some ongoing monitoring and reporting requirements will ensure that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, future city councils and the community is hearing, how is this thing progressing? Because, climate change isn't going to stop at 2030. So you want to set that up now so that you are hearing how everything's going. So that's our recommended approach.
Okay, thank you very much. So why don't we proceed with other council questions and comments? And then Mari, do we have any public speakers?
Not yet, Madam Mayor, but I'm sure we will soon.
Okay, so to participate, you can raise your hand if you're joining Zoom and press the number 9 if you're on the phone. But let's begin with our colleagues. Councilmember Weintraub.
I also chose the Albany plan. So I was glad to hear that was actually the preferred plan. I don't need to restate the reasons, but one of the things that I definitely support is the Citizen Advisory Committee for getting the community involved in this. And I forget what plan it was, but they did a community-wide survey asking for priorities. So that's something that I would want to see. But another thing that struck me through all of these plans is so much is evolving and changing on climate action coming from the state, the feds. So I think whatever document we have, has to be something that is easily updated and just doesn't become stale as new state laws are changing and federal guidelines. But I really liked the Albany plan, and I think that's the most user-friendly and something that we can really take action on.
And would you agree that we should add an implementation component as well as a monitoring and maybe annual reports?
That was my question. Where is it in my notes? Let's see. Wait, where did it go? Oh, can option 3, Albany, be done to include implementation measures and responsibilities? So that was in my notes.
I think so. We'll make a note of that supporting implementation. And then Dean, I think it was you also recommended, as far as kind of modifying it slightly, a tracking and monitoring with annual reports or something to that effect.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything else, Councilmember Weintraub?
No, I don't need to restate the reasons, but I was happy that it was Albany.
Great. All right, Councilmember Kraut.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'll jump to the conclusion. I would also agree Albany is the plan that I much prefer. And I certainly do want to see an implementation plan included in there and monitoring as well. Just a couple of thoughts or questions, if I could, though. One, what I liked about Albany was that it was readable. And I think your summary really said it's something that somebody would actually sit down and read. And I think that's important because if people don't read it, then it's not going to get the action that it needs. I did like in the Agora Hills plan, the greater use of maps and the detailing of the maps showing the areas of concern. I thought that was very, very helpful. And I know that we in the city of Calabasas have a very similar use of maps in our presentations, and I think that'd be pretty easy to incorporate. I did notice when I looked at the plans and how they evolved, what really wasn't captured here was they were in 2008, 2013, 2019, 2021. So we're all getting better at climate plans now. There's a lot of material out there. And I'm sure in 2008, when Claremont was writing theirs, they were probably doing a lot of scrounging, trying to find the information to put in there. So that kind of brings me to the question of, when we work with an outside consultant, what would you say is the percentage of, forgive me for using the word, boilerplate that gets put into these products?
Walker, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a fair amount of, I think, what you could call boilerplate around the state policies, because those are things that, somebody has written before and you just update them to see if it's been, what has changed. There's some of the background on climate and the IPCC and, the different targets in the Paris Agreement. But then things start to get pretty specific fairly quickly about the community, and you do have to tailor it to, the resources that you control. So this always comes up, where are you getting your energy? We know that, but assuming you're part of Las Virgenes Water District, and you have to understand who, picks up your trash, and who's responsible for the urban forest, if it's Public Works or somebody else. And so there's a fair amount of context and customizing that comes into it. And then every community has its own set of priorities, where there's concern or where there's interest. And a lot of this gets driven by leadership, whether there's, people on the council who have specific concerns about wildfire or water security or active transportation, biking and walking. Another signal comes from the city manager, which the staff look to. So, city manager rides her bike to the office every day, there will be enhanced interest in bike lanes and active transportation. If he or she just put solar panels on his or her house. So, these are the things that, I'm being a little glib, but, just to share with you that I think consultants would like there to be more boilerplate than there actually is. But once you get into it, every plan actually does end up being relatively unique. So, I guess you could probably have 25 to 30% of a plan recycled, but that's about it.
Okay, and so the only question I think that comes up from that, and appreciate your very candid answer, would it be to our benefit to identify the consultants that have worked in cities that are very similar to ours and reach out to them in our competitive bidding process for somebody to do this, so that we can encourage them not to reinvent the wheel where it's not necessary?
Yes, and you should also do that to make sure the consultants you'd like to work with know about your RFP, because these get sort of tossed out into the world, and how consultants find them is a little bit sort of hit or miss, ad hoc. So yeah, if you like, if you work with Rincon before, make sure Rincon gets the RFP. Cascadia worked on the one for Albany. Cascadia and Rincon have worked together, so I just think it behooves you to make sure it ends up in the hands of the people that you would like to work with. And that's all fair game in a competitive bidding process, just to make sure the distribution is thorough.
I appreciate that.
I'd like to follow up on that too. you can put out an RFP for a climate action plan and you're going to get proposals that are all over the place. Or you can put out a pretty specific RFP saying, we want you to propose on this. You know, we want to use a standard set of measures. We need an inventory, we need modeling of these measures, et cetera. Or yeah, you can limit what the RFP is addressing, and then I think you're going to get much more manageable responses from your consultants that are going to try and meet what you're looking for.
Thank you, Dean. You're reading my mind. That's all I
Yeah.
have.
All right. I mean, in other words, like we could help you put together an RFP that would help you get the services you really need and not a bunch of extra stuff.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Kraut. Councilmember Bozajian.
Thank you. I concur with what's been said. I'm not going to repeat myself, but I did have some other questions, two other questions actually. One is a little bit more scientific, and if you don't know the answer, that's okay. On population density distribution for climate change purposes, if the state has 40 million people, does it matter from a climate change perspective whether as the population increases, whether you increase the density in urban areas or whether you distribute that population more evenly throughout the state? Has anyone done any studies on that, or does it not matter?
It matters. So, you know, the issue is how much you drive, the vehicle miles traveled per year in single occupant vehicles. So, you know, and if you're trying to reduce, you know, if we're assuming that most of those vehicles are fossil fuel, then driving fewer miles, you know, burns less combustion of fossil fuels and less emission of greenhouse gases. And so this is where it gets a little complicated. Among other factors, density does influence patterns of driving. Density alone doesn't do the trick. If you're going to, you know, walk or ride your bike instead of taking the car, it needs to be safe. There needs to be somewhere to go to. It needs to be pleasant. So, you know, they talk about distance to destinations, diversity of land use, urban design. There's this list of Ds that are associated with shifting patterns of travel. But density is actually the one, so where it gets a little scientific. Density is one of the ones that has the strongest elasticity, which means it can stretch behavior greater than most other things. So yes, density matters, but for it to work, again, there have to be safe alternatives to driving and places to go to.
Right, and the other part of that is just in general, denser cities tend to have lower per capita emissions. So residents of New York City, which is highly dense, or Manhattan, have much lower emissions per capita than residents of Calabasas, for instance, because most of them live in high rises or in apartments that are using less energy. So in addition to the emissions reductions from transit and having subways and other ways to get around than driving, you also get energy efficiency from the dense buildings as well.
Right, smaller units, and then you have thermal transfer between the units. So, you know, a house has a lot of exterior walls, so it's trying to modulate its temperature with the outside, whereas if you're in an apartment building, energy is moving between the walls. So there's all of these sort of compounding benefits of, you know, more dense places. I just don't want to overstate that, you know, density is a silver bullet to solving all of these things. But, you know, in your city, this would be sort of general planning, long range planning. You could look at some areas that might be a good fit for, you know, urban village creation, where you bring in all of those ingredients such that it could actually result in, as Dean's mentioning, energy savings in the buildings, as well as reduced use of single occupancy vehicles and driving. Then you get the sort of
I was asking more in a general sense. I don't know how much we're going to be able to do that within our small city.
Right.
The other question I had, actually, it was more of a statement, and then I'll be done. As many people know, because I've talked about it before, I'm very big on natural vegetation. And one of the things I really regret is that early on in the city's history, we did not have ordinances in effect. I'm not talking about tearing up people's, houses or anything like that. But as new developments occurred, particularly a lot of our commercial developments or multifamily dwellings, we allowed a lot of non-native vegetation and a lot of inefficient resources. And I hope that as we move forward, one of the first things we do is to implement a prospective ordinance not permitting that kind of thing anymore, absent extraordinary circumstances, and also incentivizing people to the extent we can to change our own vegetation patterns. We're never, as I look around the city, we're never going to be able to go back to what we had. Even if the drought is over for a year or two, it's going to come back, and people have to learn to live in a more climate-friendly, landscaping. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just add one last comment to Councilmember Bozajian's, and Dean, I think you said it, and I regret that we didn't years ago plant trees on all of our open space and just have, forests, urban forests, as Walker said. But I guess it's not too late. But that gives me hope, thinking about our open space teeming with oak trees and other trees. So
all of your open space is a fantastic resource that a lot of cities don't have at all for sequestration and adaptation. So you're starting off in a really great position.
great. And I think we'd be willing to do innovative things like that. Madam Clerk, are there any speakers from the public?
Yes, Madam Mayor, we have Andy Schrader ready to speak.
Hi, Council. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor and City Council for hearing this presentation and for moving forward the climate action plan. I'm really pleased that you're all doing this, and thank you to Dean and Walker for an excellent presentation. Monica Parmar and I sent in a pretty detailed comment email earlier today, but I want to hit a few of the items for the record. I want to echo that the most important component of any climate action plan is definitely a specific directed implementation plan with a timeline and responsibility and resources tied to city budgeting. So I just wanted to echo that. I think the other important thing to emphasize again is that climate change isn't just going to be a little increase in heat and then a stabilization. As long as the people of the planet Earth continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions, the climate will continue to get hotter and more out of control and more unpredictable, with more wildfires and worsening water and food scarcity. It's not a drought anymore. We're into an era of water scarcity. So that's all to say that our climate action plan needs to really focus first on dropping our emissions as quickly as possible. And as we develop this concurrently, I think we should move forward before we develop the climate action plan with the really obvious legislation on building decarbonization. We've got an expert on the council on that particular item. And for both new and existing buildings, the city of Los Angeles, with 4 million people next door, is aiming for January 1st, 2023 to decarbonize new buildings. So if LA can do it, we can certainly do it in Calabasas, and I encourage you to move on that quickly. Also, an effective climate action plan must be comprehensive and a systems approach to sustainability and environmental health. For instance, in the state of California, moving and cleaning water uses some of the most energy in the state. So a robust water conservation strategy helps reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And to echo Councilmember Bozajian, preserving open space with native habitat connectivity helps allow for flora and fauna the ability to migrate in response to climate impacts, and healthy soil and native plants really help sequester carbon dioxide. So I second that. The Claremont Climate Action Plan really said it best, quote, "Any comprehensive environmental sustainability plan must recognize the wisdom of
Sorry, Mr. Schrader, it looks like that's an automatic clock. That's new to me.
Madam Mayor, we have no other speakers.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, Dean. Thank you, Walker. I want to just see if we can if staff has enough direction, and Kindon, also, can you just clarify for me and for the public, my colleagues, the use of consultants? I mean, Dean has done such tremendous work in such a short period of time to get us where we are, and he really seems to understand our city and our council. What role will Dean have moving forward, Walker? And then is it an RFP for the plan itself? How do you envision that working with consultants?
Thank you, Mayor. I think to answer your first question, we've heard loud and clear that the council is unanimous in the decision to move forward with an Albany or a modified Albany type of approach. And so we can do that. What I'd like to do next is meet with Dean and Walker to figure out next steps. And I think, so our contract with Dean and Walker was very limited, and it's going to be coming to an end. Now, per the city code, I have the opportunity to amend that, and we'll probably need to do that. And that could then mean, based on the steps that we outline, how Dean and Walker could help us in that process. And again, I think going back to the second part of your question of how the consulting team works is, as I mentioned earlier, Dean's experience, Walker's experience, both in municipal government, they can come in and quickly identify the resources and talents that we have, help us maximize those. And then at the same time, as Councilmember Kraut and Dean were discussing in that conversation, craft the RFP in such a way that it allows staff to do some of the work to minimize costs, but then also allows an outside consultant team to really come in and hit those specifics where we would need an inventory or whatever those components are that we couldn't do in-house. And that might be a combination of a consulting team, or as Dean mentioned, a civic spark intern, which would be a huge cost savings as well. So what I'd like to do is meet with Dean and Walker and chart out what we would see as those next steps. And I think we could do that relatively quickly, and then be able to then come back to a council, depending on the scope, if we even need to go out to an RFP. I think if the council is ready, Mayor, you could request that motion at this point to move forward with some type of an RFP to do that, if we want to really expedite this. And but I think it would merit a good discussion with Dean and Walker as well too.
I think my colleagues would agree with me that time is of the essence here. I don't know how to, and I'll ask you, Kindon, to look at how we can move this forward on a regular basis, as we did with the strategic priorities planning, where we scheduled extra meetings, or using the Environmental Commission meeting schedule to hold our large public forums and workshops. That's, for me, the timeline is critical. Are you suggesting that this evening that, and Matt, could I make a motion that we begin developing an RFP? Is that your suggestion, Kindon?
Yeah, so and maybe twofold is direction from council, one, to meet with Dean and Walker in a subsequent meeting. Another step with that might be, Mayor, is that the Sustainability Task Force meets together again after I've had that meeting with Dean and Walker. And then if we're ready, I think then we can move forward with an RFP. I don't think there's reason to come back to council to discuss that again, unless the council feels there is. I think we have pretty clear direction, and if the council authorizes the Sustainability Task Force to provide any extra guidance or direction as that body, then that will expedite it as well.
And I would just add, Madam Mayor, that the council could vote tonight to provide that direction to staff and to the climate task force. And then the next action to return would be a draft contract for preparation of a climate action plan consistent with tonight's direction regarding an Albany or modified Albany approach.
Okay, Mayor Pro Tem, Shapiro, do you have any comments on what's being recommended?
No, it makes sense to me. Good sense. The only item you mentioned, which I agree with, handling some of the public forums and outreach through the Environmental Commission also makes great sense.
Kendon, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I apologize, Mayor. One thing that I wanted to bring up for the entire council and Dean, we talked about this earlier. Can we talk just briefly about funding and the options of maybe even some available funding from the outside? Dean, I'm not sure what we can disclose from our previous meeting, but you did mention that there are outside agencies that we could probably tap into some grant funding to augment the 50,000 that we already have. And so I don't know how much we can share on that, but I just want to make the council aware of that I don't think we're necessarily constrained to the 50,000 that we have. There may be some additional funding out there.
Yeah, that's correct. I at least know of one or two places where we could look for some additional money that might be available to Calabasas to help with your planning.
Sorry
Okay.
to interrupt, Mayor. I just thought that was important to bring in.
Yeah, that is a very important. Matt, could you kindly restate what you just summarized for us as a motion, and then I'll ask for someone to move that.
Happy to. It would be a motion to direct staff and the climate task force to move forward with development of a RFP and contract for a proposed climate action plan at the independent sustainable model per the Albany approach, with the next step to be returning to council with a proposed contract.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
Any discussion? Comments, questions? Okay, Madam Clerk, could you take the roll, please?
Councilmember Bozajian,
Aye.
Councilmember Kraut,
Yes.
Councilmember Weintraub,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro,
Yes.
Mayor Mauer.
Yes.
Motion carries.
And great. And I want to thank my colleague, Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro, City Manager Kendon Meek, and Glenn and Alex, who are not here this evening. And of course, our consultant Dean Kubani and now Walker Wells. Thank you all, and especially all my colleagues. This is something that has been a priority for, I think, all of us for a long time, and to make room for us to move forward quickly and in earnest is very exciting. So I want to thank you all. And that's it. All right. And Dean Walker, thank you again.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Yes. All right, we're gonna move forward on the agenda.
Can we take a break?
Yes, indeed. How about, how much time, Dean?
Just 5 minutes. I need to get some out of my car.
Yep, 5 minutes it is. We'll be back. Thank you. And be mindful that our audio and video will be on. I can't believe we all chose All right, it looks like everybody is back. Let me just. Mari, is everybody back?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
All right,
Oh, Councilmember, Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro, sorry, he's not back. I apologize. Everyone's here, Madam Mayor.
all right, so we will restart the meeting. We're on item consent items. There are items 2 through 9. Does anyone wish any of the items to be removed? I'm not seeing any hands or hearing any comments. Is there a motion to approve items 2 through 9?
I'll make the motion to approve.
Second.
All right, Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
We'll do, Madam Mayor. We have no public comment on the consent. Councilmember Bozajian,
Aye.
Councilmember Kraut,
Aye.
Councilmember Weintraub,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro,
Yes.
Mayor Mauer.
Aye.
Carries.
All right, we're on to item number 10, which is adoption of resolution number 2022-1809, authorizing the submittal of an application for the used oil payment program for the next 5 years. Actually, was that a consent, Maury?
Madam Mayor, I believe that was part of the consent
Okay,
calendar.
sorry about that. And then let's go on to continuing a public hearing for the following matter. Number 12, adoption of resolution number 2022-1807, certifying the results of the assessment ballot proceedings with respect to the proposed assessment increase for Las Villas HOA Zone 11 within Landscape Lighting District number 22. Are there any changes or additions to the staff report?
Hi, Madam Mayor. No additional changes.
Thank you, Mr. Yalda. Are there any city council questions regarding the staff report? We do not see any hands up. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on this item, Madam Clerk?
There are none, Madam Mayor.
All right. If there are no speakers, the public hearing is closed. May I have a motion to approve this item?
So moved.
Seconded.
Okay, with that, Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Councilmember Bozajian,
Aye.
Councilmember Kraut,
Aye.
Councilmember Weintraub,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro,
Yes.
Mayor Mauer.
Yes.
Carries 5-0.
All right, we are now on to informational reports. Item 13, the check register for the period of June 11th through July 25th, 2022. Are there any questions about the check registry? I'm not seeing any. And let's move on to council announcements, starting with Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro.
Just welcome back to everyone, and please be careful as school's beginning in a couple weeks before our next meeting. So please drive safely.
Wonderful. Councilmember Bozajian.
2 announcements. One, while the council was in recess over the last month, the RFP went out for the roof repairs to the Agoura Hills Calabasas Community Center. The RFP is available on the city website, and submissions are due on August 25th. And Kendon, one quick question. Do you anticipate when that's coming back to the council?
Matt, help me out on this one. I think let me check on that, Councilmember Bozajian, and get back to you on that, just on the date.
Okay, well, to the general public, then just be aware that it is coming back, and you can comment on it publicly on the submissions when they're submitted. It'll be a public report. The other thing I would mention is that as of last Thursday, my year as president of the League Division of the League of California Cities, the Los Angeles County Division, concluded. Thank you very much to everybody. on the council and the staff for being very supportive during that year. And thank you especially to Peter for coming to the, I guess, leaving ceremonies and all the way in Diamond Bar. It was a great year and I appreciate everything that happened, and it was a great experience for me professionally. Thank you.
Thank you for your service there, Councilmember Bozajian. Councilmember Weintraub.
Just two quick things. In anticipation of the dreaded school traffic that comes with the return of school, we are trying to get ahead of the situation. And tomorrow, the school area subcommittee, Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro and myself are meeting with staff and the school district and Viewpoint and representatives from Lost Hill Sheriff Station just to strategize, make sure everything's in place, and to make it as painless as possible with the new school year. So that is happening tomorrow, and we'll let everyone know how that meeting goes. And just a second thing real quick, I know we're all doing our best to conserve water and want to make sure that we are using, that we are only using, that we are only being efficient with our water use. And I thought that my family, that we were doing everything we could, but we were still having issues and there was still some inefficient water use. So I called the water district and they were so amazing. And there's just, if you're having any issues, it's really best to call them because it's a lot more than just you can use drip this many days and only water outside. It's really understanding your water budget and how your pool comes into play. And as soon as we made some changes that were suggested, I got our water bill today. It's the lowest it's ever been, and it was only efficient use. So just reach out to the water district and they really want to help, and their suggestions just made all the difference. So, and if anyone can't get through to them, I'm happy to share what I learned, but they're a great resource to help us through this. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And Councilmember Kraut.
Thank you. We're doing announcements or task force reports?
Right now, we're just on announcements and
Okay.
then we will do task force reports. But if you have both, you could segue into.
No, I'll stay in order here. I was just making sure I was in the right spot on the agenda. I think the biggest event in Calabasas that's coming up hasn't been mentioned yet, so I'll go ahead and jump in and do it so the mayor doesn't have to introduce herself. Which is next Thursday, a week from tomorrow. The Chamber of Commerce is hosting the Mayoral Breakfast, honoring Mary Sue Maurer for her wonderful service this year. That's going to be 7:30 to 9 a.m. hosted by the Chamber of Commerce. You can get more information there. I believe chamber members are $60 or non-chamber members would be $75. And I think there are still tickets left. So if you want to come join us, that'd be great. There's also a VICA's annual local office holders luncheon coming up on the same day. That's in the afternoon from 11:30 to 2. And that's all I've got.
Thank you. All right, let's move to council task force reports. Councilmember Kraut.
Okay, back to me again. So actually, we were out the month of July, but it was a pretty busy month for many of us. The Gory Hills Calabasas Community Center Task Force or committee, I should say, met twice during that period. And as James mentioned, the roof is moving forward. That's great news. Also wanted to mention that the Calabasas landfill gave a tour to Councilmember Weintraub and myself. And we were able to see their current operation and the things that they do to safeguard the public and the area where they're eyeing for that waste. Oh my gosh, I've lost the words for it.
The digester, the anaerobic
digester. Thank you, Kendon. The digester location, which is well away from the city of Calabasas, away from the views, and they do some amazing stuff there to protect our groundwater and stuff. So it was a fantastic tour. And there was a few other things. I'm sure we had an FBI briefing as well. And our Lost Hill Sheriff Station did a great event out in Westlake Village, which I was able to attend, and of course the League of California Cities. But other than that, we had the month of July off. Thank you.
Thank you. Task force reports, Councilmember Weintraub.
And we had a good economic development meeting, Peter and myself, yesterday. So a lot of activity happening in the city. So that's good to hear. And we'll bring back, we should put it on a future agenda item, just an update to all the council with some of the things that we've been briefed on that can come to the whole council. So Kindon, that would be a good thing to do.
That'd be great. Mayor Pro Tem Shapiro?
I'll just be very brief. I had Valley Economic Alliance board meeting, and the appreciation for the sponsors is coming up in a couple of weeks, a special event. There's a push for housing throughout the San Fernando Valley, affordable housing, and had a number of meetings with SCAG, including regional council and other meetings as well. And VICA has already been covered. Peter got that. And we did have I believe we had a wireless task force meeting, and we have one coming up again, Alicia and myself, and that's it. Thank you.
And you had a sustainability task force meeting too. Councilmember Bozajian.
Sorry, I mixed both of them together, so I don't have any analysis. Thank you.
That's all right. Okay. Are there any requests for future agenda items or for information? We heard Councilmember Weintraub about some of the economic development projects going on in the city. Yes, Councilmember Weintraub. Anything else?
Just, and I don't exactly know how to frame it, and Kindon can help me, but just some more, if we can have an agenda item discussion on some public safety issues, and we can make that, we can drill down into that, whether focusing on school safety and what the city is going to do to support that and some other things. But if we can get that back.
Could we have some, rather, I'm sure it won't be just open-ended. You'll provide us some information before the meeting.
Yeah.
Great. I was looking at Kindon, but thanks.
and
You
thank you.
can't tell who I'm looking at.
I'll
All
provide
right,
it.
good.
And Mayor and Council, just for your information, I am meeting with Captain C2 on Tuesday. We've talked a lot over the last couple months, but this will be our first sit down, and we're going to spend a couple hours. One of those is to address some of the items that were adopted in our strategic plan on public safety. And so we'll be talking about those, and then also just some of these other issues that have come up in different conversations. So I'll have more to report after that meeting.
And in general, I believe we planned some updates on the strategic plan. So when those, I don't know if it was quarterly or how often, but at some point we'll add those too. All right, anybody else? I don't see anything. So that is it for this evening. Thank you all again very much. And the council will adjourn to a regular meeting scheduled August 24th. We are going into closed session this evening, correct? We'll see the rest of you Wednesday, August 24th at 7 p.m. So see my colleagues in a minute. Good night.
Right.
Good night.